What we want to do is we want to find a way to drain effectively any water that's left over on the screen. There's a couple of ways to do that. One of them is putting them into a rack and having a fan behind it, blowing air directly on it. We don't want to let the screens sit flat because that can allow the water to puddle. And if you happen to have any hard water or soft water, that can cause those minerals to collect there, and that can create an issue for you with adhesion of the emulsion later on in the process. So ideally, we want to have it at a little bit of a tip. All you need to do is put some 2x2s, a stack of cleanup cards, whatever you have underneath the rack to tip it forward, have a fan behind it. I recommend getting a HVAC filter to put behind the fan to keep dust from moving, from the air movement through all of that to keep your screens clean. If you can, is you want to have a dehumidifier in that space to make sure that you're moving warm, dry air. Not always possible in a lot of shops, I get that. But having a dehumidifier in your space is really important, especially if your space is dual purpose. You will end up using that dehumidifier to not only dry your wet screens, but also, of course, to dry your emulsion. This, I'm not sure how many quarts this one is. It looks like it's maybe a 4 or 5 quart dehumidifier. I have it set to always on, continuous. And so it's always pumping air through it. It's always working on pulling out moisture. It also creates pretty good airflow in and of itself. Pretty good gust of wind that I've got coming out of the side. And it's warm. We always talk about having warm, dry air moving over and around your screens. In a small environment, your dehumidifier is going to be almost all the heat that you will ever need. With a system like this or a rack like this, we just want to have fans. You can either get 20-inch box fans or a standing fan. And you want to set it up so that it blows air directly across, whether it's here or here, it doesn't matter. But as it blows directly across the emulsion, and you want that to be picking up the dry, warm air that comes out of the dehumidifier. And that's going to accelerate the drying of your emulsion. The angle of application of your scoop cutter and how much pressure you're using going forward or back. And I'll show you what I mean. So we have here our standard scoop cutter, sharp side, round side. But specifically what I want to talk about is as we actually get this here and as we are, as it slides forward, we have the opportunity to put pressure back, which allows it to cut more, or put pressure more flat or more forward, which is always going to influence how much emulsion is actually pushed through the mesh and how much is cut. So for those of us who have been coating for a while and have a good sense of touch, a good sense of feel, we can use the round side of the coater and actually get a thinner deposit than using the sharp side. Go back a little bit on our angle. We understand the flow as everything goes like this. Of course, this is for those of us coating single-handed. For those of us using 2 hands to coat, leaning the screen against the wall, it's all about applied pressure. Are we forward or back? There's a lot of ways to put emulsion on the screen. None of them are incorrect, but we want to make sure that there is enough emulsion down on our screen so that when we hold it into the light, we can get what's called a glisten effect. There is a difference between coating thin thread and coating standard thread. Thin thread, as its name implies, the thread diameter is thinner than standard mesh. And as a result, that open area between the weaves, that hole, is wider. This allows everything to flow through easier. Water-based ink, plastisol, every ink substrate, but also emulsion. So you need to be more careful when you coat your screens when you have thin thread than standard, because you can put too much emulsion on there. You get a very thick stencil. And emulsion thickness is directly proportionate to your exposure time. There's also white thread versus yellow thread. Yellow thread takes 30% longer, but the thicker your emulsion layer, the longer your exposure time, the longer it takes for the light to actually penetrate through the entirety of your emulsion layer. Because I'm using a 19-inch scoop coater, and 19 is almost the entire width of the screen, this is the 20 by 24, I'm going to turn my screen this way to scoop coat. For this, I'm using very even pressure front and back. And I'm actually going to go 2 and 1. I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. So this was the top of the screen, now it's the bottom. And I did not do the greatest job. So let's see if we can show you this. But you can see some thicker parts of my stencil on the edges. It just goes back to me not being, I don't coat as often as I want anymore. So I'm a little out of practice. But that just goes back to me not being consistent with my pressure and being up and down with my force application. Let's see, can I get, there we go. Right here, you can see where it's a little bit darker. Basically, I have a thicker emulsion deposit down there. So that will actually take longer to expose. So we're seeing a pretty good glisten effect. I don't see any dull areas. And that is what's most important, because we know we have emulsion now on top of the threads and under the threads, fully encapsulating the threads, which is the most important part. If you find that you have, oh, there's a really good way to see that I have, it's too thick right there. But we're going to be fine overall, especially for what we're doing here. And it's a really good way to show that everyone makes mistakes. It's how you recover from them that really counts. Having emulsion all the way wrapped around your threads is important, because that's how the emulsion holds on. It is vacuum versus compression. Vacuum is always going to give you a better seal, a better close to zero type of contact with the film into your stencil, so that when the light is hitting it, it doesn't have any chance to wrap around the edges and give you soft, fuzzy edges, which is why we always say, or anyone that has a compression lid, as heavy as you can with the weight on top of it, on top of that cushion, to give you that solid positive contact. Up here is those areas that were really thick, and you can see I've got the dreaded scumming. You guys know what scumming looks like. It's the underexposed emulsion. You can see there's some lint and whatnot in my water-only dip tank. You can see things start to dissolve here and peel away on the exposure strip. And in the solid areas of our image, you can see here, so those are the thicker areas. So you can see the thicker areas of the stencil right here, here, here in the corners where I got it thick. Get it into the light. There we go. It looks milky. And the reason why it's milky is because it's not fully cross-linked. It's not exposed properly. And that's exactly what we knew what was going to happen. We knew that this is going to be, those areas were going to be underexposed in relation to the main area of our stencil. When you're spraying out your screen, we don't want to use any kind of real water pressure on this side. Remember, the emulsion is actually thinner there, and we're actively trying to create enough emulsion on top to actually hold up for durability and abrasion. But when we hit it with a pressure washer, that's when we're ever really going to see on press. And you can actually blast it out. You can blast it out from the other side too if you get too close. Not every shop space is going to be able to hit the perfect conditions to create the perfect stencil. And it's not so much about actually achieving and doing. It's about creating the processes, creating the checks and balances, creating the steps to get to as good as you can within the space you can.